Welcome to the Prophecy Study, and this week we are going to be looking at chapter 15. We're going to be closing out chapter 15, the shortest chapter in the book of Revelation, chapter 15. It is followed by chapter 16, which is one of the worst chapters in the Bible. We'll do that on next setting. I'll preview a little bit of it, but right now we'll get into chapter 15. So we're going to start, we left off with verse 4, and we're going to start with verse 5. And John says, "After this I looked, and I saw in heaven the temple, that is, the tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was opened." So this is going to be, if you've ever gone to a play, they do like one act and they don't change. All is in the same scene, and they do one act which carries one theme or one set of information. And then they close the curtain and all the furniture gets changed, and then the curtain goes up, and now we're into Act 2. So what he's talking about now, because he says, after this. So the previous things that we looked at in chapter 15, that was what he was talking about when he said, after this. So it's like he talked about some things that happened, and then the curtain closed, and he's back in his little cave there in Patmos, and he says, after this. So the curtain had closed, and now we're up now. He's going to talk on a different but related subject. And so that would be like, moving on. Now, when it says, I saw in heaven the temple, that is the tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was open. So now this is saying it is open to all. If you remember the tearing of the veil, and so I believe that's in Ephesians, and when Jesus died, so going back to the tabernacle, and it's the same thing of whether it was a tabernacle or the temple, but in the temple or in the tabernacle, you had the Holy of Holies, and only a certain priest, the high priest, could go into the Holy of Holies, and then only one time a year. So, and that was only for one person. And what went on the other side of the Holy of Holies? Well, we don't know, because we are not the high priest. And so what he's saying is, you remember in the temple and the tabernacle, the temple is the building. Tabernacle is the same thing as the temple, but it was in a tent. And then after they established themselves in Jerusalem, they built a temple which mirrored the tabernacle. Now the dimensions were a little different, but as far as having, the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, and the outward court of the Gentiles and things like that, both appear in both the tabernacle and the temple. And so what was happening back in there is the Jews were the only ones allowed. And if you were Gentiles, you had your court of the Gentiles, which was outside, and you could go into that area. And so this is very important, because the curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, the curtain was 8 inches thick, and it was made of, I forget how many layers, about 4 or 5 layers, and some made of different materials. And so that was the curtain. So nobody could go behind the curtain except for the high priest. And so when Jesus died, there was an earthquake, and the temple, the Bible says rent, which means ripped. So the curtain was rent in half, and it was torn from the top down, which symbolizes God doing this. And what that symbolized when that happened here on earth, when Jesus died, it symbolized now it was finished. Remember, Jesus said, it is finished. And so the work of Jesus coming to the Jews for salvation and the law, that was finished. And now we're under the age of grace, which started with at this time when Jesus died, rose again, when he was on the cross and he died, the earthquake shook and the temple, the curtain in the temple ripped from the top down. That symbolizes that God has now opened to view for everybody, Jew and Gentile. There's now no, and you can read about this in Ephesians, there is now no barrier for Gentiles to come to God. And so here he says, and it was opened, meaning now heaven is open to both Jew and Gentile because it's the age of grace. And this is the new covenant that we, at least in this study, there's no Jewish people here. So when I say we, I'm talking about the non-Jews. So we now have access to God. So here, this is talking about what we saw in Ephesians and what we saw in the life of Jesus. So he said, I saw in heaven the temple. Remember, the temple is going to be destroyed on earth, but there is going to be a temple during the millennium in heaven. Once we get to eternity, there will be no more temple because there'll be no more need of a temple, because a temple is where God resided and we came to him. But once we're into eternity, God resides everywhere. And we can just walk up to them and ask questions and have a conversation, things like that. That's my opinion. But there is going to be no temple in the eternity. So now it's open. It's like tearing the veil. We see in Matthew 27:51, at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. So that is what is now happening in Revelation. Okay, verse 6. Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen and wore golden sashes around their chests. So we've seen the heavenly temple before when we were in Revelation, chapter 11 and 19, so I'm not going to go back into that, but we have seen this temple before, a few chapters back. Remember, when we get to Revelation, it looks like, and even in the other books of the Bible, there's, it's not, the Bible is not written sequentially. And so I may say, I walked over to Jim's house today. And then I go back and I say, I walked up King Street, I took a left at Lafayette Street, I stopped at the 7th house down, knocked on the door, and Jim let me in. So I said I went to Jim's house today, then I go back and fill in the other details. And that's what Revelation does all the time. It tells you what's coming, and then it goes back and it says, here is what led up to that. So, and so that's what's happening before. We saw the temple in chapter 11. We saw that there was one. Now, in chapter 15, they're giving us more steps to what's happening along the way. So this shows that God is the source of the coming trouble. Out of the temple came the angels with the 7 plagues. So now it's making sure we understand that these things are coming from God because they came out of the temple. They didn't come out of the earth. They didn't come out of the abyss. They came out of the temple which was in heaven. So as these 7 angels are coming out with the 7 plagues, they're being sent out by God. So we have to understand that God is orchestrating this at this time. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. Let me take a minute to tell you about the bowls. Now, first of all, the bowls are part of the temple utensils. So we learned that in the Old Testament when there was a tabernacle, and word has it, and I can't confirm this, but I've heard it from all kinds of different sources. The Jews know that they're going to be rebuilding the temple. Okay, now that is in the Old Testament, but it's very unclear. So either some Jewish people have read the Old Testament very carefully. They understand that the temple is coming again. Or maybe they've talked to Christians. I know they don't kind of take a lot of what we say, but we say there's going to be a new temple. The New Testament tells us that. It's there in the Old Testament if you know what to look for. And so these instruments, as we speak right now, the Jews are building things like the altar, like the lavers, like the candlesticks, and the utensils like the golden bowls. They're actually building those things. So when the Jews get their third temple, everything's going to be ready to move in, and they're going to be able to start worshiping the temple very, very quickly. They are building the temple outside of Jerusalem, and they're going to be like Legos. So when time comes, they're going to be, when we learned about the new heaven and new earth, we learned that there is going to be a new temple, and you're not going to hear any building sounds. So in other words, they're not bringing the stones there and then chiseling them square and hammering. They got a bunch of gold and they have to hammer it into a shovel for the ashes or something like that. You'll hear no sound of the building. So all they're going to do is they're going to bring the big blocks for the temple, and they're going to be able to set them in place without sound. So the golden bowls, they very well may have made some of these yet. I don't know where they are in their building process. But so the thing to understand about the bowls are that if you look in the King James, it calls these vials. So these are going to be the vial judgment. In the modern Bibles, like NIV, they call them bowls, not vials. So what really, technically, the definition is in English, translating the Greek to the English, what it really is a vessel. But we don't use those words anymore. I wouldn't say Dottie has a vessel of water. You wouldn't say that. You'd say she has a glass of water, a bottle of water. And so when the new people kind of gave the definitions, vessel was a word that people don't know. And so they changed it. King James called it a vial. But nowadays, when you think about a vial, or at least I think about a vial, it's like like a little tube type of thing. And if you had water in a vial and you had water in a bowl, if you turned them both upside down, if you had the same amount of water in both, and you turned them both upside down at the same time, which is going to empty first? The bowl, because it's wide open. You dump it out, it's all gone. And so so they put the word bowl in there to symbolize that these plagues are going to come faster than the other ones. And we can see, because in the other ones, there was time. If you read what we already read for the seals and the trumpets, you see that there is time. They blew one trumpet, and then there was a time period before they blew the second trumpet. And now what we're going to see is that these are going to come very, very, very quick. There's no time in between to repent. As we talked about a couple of sessions ago, that time has passed. God gave them all kinds of opportunities, but at least at one time they're going to end. And so with the bowl pouring out, you don't have time to repent from one plague to the next. So they're going to go very, very quickly. And they were filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. So this is almost to say, because in the tribulation period, the believers are not going to be affected by the plagues. We talked about that last time, just like the Israelites in the land of Goshen back when Moses was calling all these plagues out on Egypt. The land of Goshen, which is where the Israelites lived in that time, was not affected. So if they had boils on their skin and hands and even on their cows, the people that lived in Goshen that were Israelites didn't get those boils. And so God is saying that, as he's talking about these bowls, and then he says God's wrath is going to be forever and ever. This is almost to say he's going to guard us all the way. We're not going to be affected by these things. Psalm 121:4, David says, Indeed, he who watches over Israel does not slumber or sleep. You remember when Elijah went up to Mount Carmel and challenged 400 prophets of Baal. And so what he said is, you go first to the ones that were worshiping Baal. He said, you go first, make your sacrifice and put your sacrifice on there, and then call God down to take his sacrifice that was sacrificed to him, their God. Call your God and have him come down and take the sacrifice. And they couldn't. They danced around, they cut themselves, they did all kinds of bad, weird things. And you know what? Jump and dance and cry as much as they want. It didn't happen. So then Elijah said, let's do this. On my altar, where he put the cow, he said, let's do this. Get a bunch of buckets of water and just soak that thing. Soak the wood, soak the offering, soak it with water. This thing should not start fire. And Elijah prayed, and lightning came down. It consumed everything on the altar. The Bible said that it actually they had a trough around there, and they said that it actually licked up the water that was in there, and everything burnt. And so one of the things that Elijah, God can be funny. He's got a sense of humor. And so what Elijah said was he started mocking them. And where's your God? How come did he go on a trip? Maybe he's sleeping. Holler a little louder because maybe he didn't hear you. And so, that connection with this passage in Psalm and this passage in Revelation shows that God watched over Israel, and God does not slumber or sleep. And so these other false gods must be asleep because they can't do anything for you. But our God, the same God as Israel's God, our God does not slumber or sleep. Some of you know I have had a back problem recently, and I have been up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning just walking around the house because I had the pain in my back. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sit. I had to walk. And this verse gives me hope and confidence. I know 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm in pain. God sees me. And I have used that time to pray to God, not to take my pain away, but show me what he wants me to learn from this pain. So God is with us. He does not slumber or sleep. Verse 8, and the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. So, and the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. Sometimes he appears in a cloud. Sometimes he appears in smoke. So what's the difference between the two? The cloud, and it says Jesus is going to be coming back on a cloud. A cloud is clean and white and good, whereas smoke is not. Smoke means something's been burnt. Yeah. And so that's not a good thing. And these symbols happen to appear in the Bible from all places. When God passes judgment on something, if there is smoke involved, he's mad, but sometimes he comes down in his glory, and that would be a white cloud. So cloud and smoke are basically the same thing. I know obviously there's differences, and smoke has little bits of particles of things that are burning, whereas clouds are made of water, clean water, and so that's what comes down. Actually, the cloud that rains, if you want to say anything about the water, you want to say, well, actually water can be acidic because it's, what do they call it? Acid rain. But that's once it enters the earth. The cloud, when it lets go its water, is perfectly clean and perfect to drink. But what does the cloud do? The water comes through the atmosphere, and the atmosphere, which is part of the earth, which is where the sin is, attaches to this rain, and yes, it becomes bad. But originally, the cloud is clean and white, and we see it as white, and it symbolizes something good. Filled with smoke, not good. Something's not going right. No one could enter the temple. Heaven is unassailable. In other words, nobody that doesn't belong there, the angels can come and go, but they are not going into the temple at this time. So there is nobody that can defile this. He says it's closed. Nobody's coming in. God will get word out if he wants to give it to an angel that relays something down there on earth. But no one's entering the temple. So nobody can. Believe me, Satan would want to if he could, but he can't. So we have seen this cloud before. Here it calls it smoke, but we've seen it before as a cloud. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. See, this is a cloud. And so this cloud is because the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So that's a good thing. That's the glory of God. That is going to be a cloud, white. The cloud has turned to smoke now because of judgment. Now we see this in Exodus on Mount Sinai, again with Moses. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. Why did Moses go up the mountain at this particular time? Because there was sin in the camp. He came down from the mountain, and Aaron had made a golden calf, and the people were all dancing around it and worshiping the calf. And that's when we find that Moses is the most terrible man in the Bible. He broke all 10 commandments at once. That's a joke. But anyway, he came down and he saw them worshiping this golden calf. And he went back up. And when he went back up to say, oh God, look what I've done, and they didn't follow me and all this and that, and that God was not happy. And so he came down with a cloud, with smoke. And he descended and he spoke to Moses again and, gave him the 10 Commandments again. He wrote them a second time on tablets and brought them down because he threw them down and broke them the first time. So he went up again, and that's where the smoke was, because God was mad because of what they were doing. So this shows the difference between smoke and a cloud. Also, not only that scene in Exodus, but Isaiah says, at the sound of their voices, the doorpost and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Now, I'm sorry I didn't put this down, but it's because something had been going on where they were turning away from the Lord. And so here is the temple again filled with smoke. So it's a short lesson today. The final warnings have been given. And next time we are going to pick up with chapter 16, and all the woes will have been completed. And it's going to be, we're going to look at the 7 bowls, and then, we'll get into, then after chapter 17, which is all the bad plagues, after 16, the bad plagues, then we will get into 17 and we'll talk about the whore of Babylon and all that. So that's a quick look at chapter 15 because it was a short chapter. So that finishes off 15, and next time we come together we'll be looking at chapter 16. So until we meet again, may God richly bless you.